I never thought I would end up dealing with the police over a wood stove. But here I am, sitting in my living room in Asheville, North Carolina, watching through my window as a patrol car pulls up to my neighbor's house for the third time this month. My name is Thomas Kingsley, and I have been living in the Whispering Pines community for about 5 years now. When I first moved here from Charlotte, the place seemed perfect. The mountains provided a stunning backdrop, the neighborhood was quiet, and the houses were well maintained. What I did not anticipate was dealing with Patricia Henderson, the president of our homeowners association and the biggest thorn in my side since I bought this property. Patricia is exactly what you would picture when someone says the word Karen. She is in her mid-50s, always has her blonde hair styled in that signature bob cut, drives a white Lexus SUV, and carries herself with the kind of entitled attitude that makes everyone around her uncomfortable. She took over as HOA president about 3 years ago, and since then, she has made it her personal mission to enforce every single rule in our community guidelines, no matter how petty or outdated. The wood stove situation started innocently enough. Last winter was particularly brutal in the mountains, and my heating bills were getting out of control. My house, built in the 1980s, does not have the best insulation, and running the electric heat constantly was costing me nearly $400 a month. I started researching alternative heating methods and discovered that installing a wood stove could significantly reduce my costs while also providing a backup heat source during power outages, which happen fairly regularly up here in the mountains. I did my homework. I looked up the HOA guidelines, checked with the county about permits, and even consulted with a certified installer. Nowhere in our HOA covenants did it specifically prohibit wood stoves. The guidelines mentioned that exterior modifications needed approval, but the chimney pipe would run up through my existing chimney structure, so I figured I was in the clear. I was wrong about how Patricia would interpret things. I purchased a beautiful cast iron wood stove from a local supplier in downtown Asheville. It cost me about $2,000, but the investment would pay for itself within 2 heating seasons. The installer came out in early September, before the cold weather hit, and did a professional job. He ran the stovepipe up through my fireplace chimney, installed all the necessary heat shields, and made sure everything was up to code. I even had the county inspector come out and sign off on it. For the first month, everything was great. I was burning wood from a local supplier, keeping my house toasty warm and watching my electric bill drop to almost nothing. My neighbors seemed fine with it. The smoke from the chimney was minimal since I was burning seasoned hardwood, and the stove was efficient enough that there was barely any visible output most of the time. Then, Patricia noticed. It was a Saturday morning in October when I heard the aggressive knock on my door. I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the news on my tablet when the pounding started. Not a polite knock, but the kind of authoritative hammering that makes you think something is seriously wrong. I opened the door to find Patricia standing on my porch, clipboard in hand, her face already twisted into that expression of righteous indignation she wore so well. "Thomas Kingsley," she said, not even greeting me properly. "I need to discuss a serious violation with you." I leaned against the doorframe, still holding my coffee mug. "Good morning to you too, Patricia. What is this about?" She pointed toward my roof. "That wood stove you installed. It is not approved by the HOA, and you are going to need to remove it immediately." I took a sip of my coffee, trying to stay calm. "Patricia, I checked the covenants before I installed it. There is nothing that prohibits wood stoves. I also got all the proper permits from the county." Her eyes narrowed. The covenants state that any modifications that affect the exterior appearance of the property must be approved by the board. That chimney pipe is an exterior modification. It runs through my existing chimney, I countered. The same chimney that was already there. I did not add anything to the exterior. She made a note on her clipboard, her pen scratching aggressively against the paper. I disagree with your interpretation. You will be receiving a formal notice of violation within 3 business days. You will have 30 days to remove the wood stove and restore the property to its original condition, or you will face fines. This is ridiculous, I said, feeling my blood pressure rising. I am not removing a $2,000 heating system because you have decided to interpret a vague guideline in the most restrictive way possible. Patricia's smile was cold and satisfied. Then I suppose we will see you at the next board meeting. Have a nice day, Thomas. She turned on her heel and walked back to her Lexus, which she had parked directly in front of my driveway, blocking my ability to leave. I watched her drive away, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. This was not the first time Patricia had targeted someone in the neighborhood with petty complaints, but I had hoped I would stay off her radar. The formal notice arrived exactly 3 days later, just as she had promised. It was a 2-page document full of legal language, citing section after section of the HOA covenants, most of which seemed only tangentially related to my wood stove. The letter demanded that I remove the stove within 30 days or face fines of $100 per day until compliance was achieved. I called my lawyer, David Chen, who I had used when I purchased the house. He reviewed the HOA documents and the violation notice and gave me his assessment. Honestly, Thomas, this is a gray area, he said over the phone. The language in your covenants is vague enough that she could argue either way. However, since you got county approval and the installation does not actually modify the exterior structure, you have a decent case. My advice is to request a hearing with the full board and present your case there. Sometimes these HOA presidents act unilaterally, and the rest of the board is more reasonable. I followed his advice and submitted a formal request for a hearing. The board meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday of November, held at the community clubhouse at 7 in the evening. The clubhouse was a modest building near the entrance of our neighborhood, with a small meeting room that could hold about 30 people. When I arrived, about a dozen residents were already there, most of them looking bored or annoyed at having to attend. The board consisted of 5 members, Patricia as president, 2 vice presidents named Robert Miller and Sandra Hayes, a treasurer named Michael Foster, and a secretary named Lisa Patterson. I sat in the front row, my folder of documentation on my lap. Patricia called the meeting to order with her usual self-important tone, going through the standard agenda items first, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing the budget for landscaping, and addressing a complaint about someone's dog barking too much. Finally, she got to my item on the agenda. Next, we have a hearing regarding a violation at 428 Maple Ridge Drive, the property owned by Thomas Kingsley. Mr. Kingsley has installed a wood-burning stove without board approval in violation of our architectural guidelines. I stood up and walked to the small podium they had set up for residents to address the board. "Good evening," I began, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "I appreciate the opportunity to present my case. As you all know, I installed a wood stove in my home in September. Before doing so, I thoroughly reviewed our HOA covenants and found no specific prohibition against wood stoves. I also obtained all necessary permits from Buncombe County, and the installation was inspected and approved by the county inspector. I pulled out copies of the permit and inspection report, walking them over to the board members. Patricia barely glanced at them. The covenant section that Mrs. Henderson cited refers to exterior modifications, I continued. However, my installation did not modify the exterior of my home. The stovepipe runs through my existing chimney structure, which was already part of the house. There is no new penetration, no new structure, and no change to the roofline or appearance of the property. Robert Miller, one of the vice presidents, leaned forward. Did you submit an architectural review application before installation? I did not, I admitted, because I did not believe one was required based on my reading of the covenants. The guidelines state that applications are needed for exterior modifications such as additions, fences, or outbuildings. A wood stove is an interior appliance. Sandra Hayes nodded thoughtfully. I can see your reasoning. Patricia, what is the board's specific concern here? Patricia stiffened. The concern is that residents cannot simply decide on their own what does or does not require approval. If we allow this kind of unilateral action, then everyone will start making modifications without consulting the board first. We need to maintain standards. But what standard is being violated? I asked. My house looks exactly the same from the outside. There is no aesthetic impact on the neighborhood, and I am using a clean-burning, EPA-certified stove that produces minimal smoke. Several other houses in this community have fireplaces that produce far more smoke than my stove. Michael Foster, the treasurer, spoke up. I actually drive past Thomas's house regularly, and I had not even noticed anything different until this issue came up. I think we might be making a mountain out of a molehill here. Patricia's face flushed red. The rules are the rules, Michael. We cannot pick and choose when to enforce them based on personal opinions. But we also cannot enforce rules that do not exist, Sandra countered. I have been on this board for 4 years, and I have never seen anything in our covenants that specifically addresses wood stoves. If Thomas got county approval and the installation is safe and code compliant, I am not sure what basis we have for demanding removal. The discussion went back and forth for another 20 minutes. Patricia grew increasingly agitated as it became clear that the other board members were not automatically siding with her. Finally, Robert Miller called for a vote. All in favor of upholding the violation and requiring removal of the wood stove, please raise your hand. Only Patricia raised her hand. All opposed. The other 4 board members raised their hands. Motion fails, Robert announced. The violation notice is rescinded. Mr. Kingsley, you are welcome to keep your wood stove. However, moving forward, we would appreciate if you would submit architectural review applications for any installations, just to keep the board informed, even if you believe approval is not required. I nodded, trying not to let my relief show too obviously. That sounds reasonable. Thank you for your time. As I gathered my papers and headed for the door, I could feel Patricia's eyes burning into my back. I knew this was not over the next few weeks. Things escalated in ways I never could have predicted. Patricia started showing up at my house at odd times, claiming she needed to inspect the wood stove installation for safety concerns. I refused to let her in without a proper notice, which only made her angrier. She sent me multiple emails, each one more aggressive than the last, arguing that the board had made a mistake and that she would continue to fight for the removal of my stove. Then the harassment really began. I started receiving noise complaints, claiming that the sound of me chopping wood was disturbing the peace. I would get violation notices about my trash cans being visible from the street, even though I brought them in within an hour of collection, which was well within the allowed time frame. Patricia even tried to cite me for having an unapproved garden gnome in my front flower bed, a gnome that had been there since before I bought the house. I documented everything, keeping copies of all her emails and notices. My lawyer advised me to continue being compliant and professional, but to also keep a record in case we needed to pursue harassment charges later. The situation took a turn in early December. I had gone to visit my brother in Raleigh for a long weekend, leaving on a Thursday morning and planning to return Sunday evening. I made sure my house was secure, locked all the doors and windows, and even asked my neighbor, a retired guy named Frank, to keep an eye on the place. When I pulled into my driveway Sunday evening around 6, something felt wrong immediately. The motion sensor light on my porch, which should have turned on as I approached, was not working. I got out of my truck and noticed that my front door was slightly ajar. My heart started pounding. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 before even going inside. 911, what is your emergency? I just got home and my front door is open, I said, staying on the porch. I have been out of town for 3 days. I think someone broke into my house. The dispatcher kept me on the line while sending a patrol unit to my location. Within 5 minutes, 2 Asheville Police Department officers arrived. They were professional and efficient, clearing my house room by room while I waited outside. When they gave me the all clear to come in, my stomach dropped. The living room was a mess. Drawers had been pulled open, papers were scattered across the floor, and several items seemed to be missing. But the most shocking part was my wood stove. It was gone. The entire cast iron stove, weighing probably 300 pounds, had been disconnected from the chimney pipe and removed from my house. The stovepipe was left hanging. The fireplace area was a mess of soot and debris, and there were scrape marks on my hardwood floor where something heavy had been dragged to the door. "This is bizarre," one of the officers said, looking at the scene. "I have investigated a lot of burglaries, but I have never seen someone steal a wood stove. Usually they go for electronics, jewelry, that kind of thing. This took significant effort." I walked through the rest of the house with the officers, trying to determine what else was missing. My television was still there. My laptop was still on my desk. Even the cash I kept in my nightstand drawer was untouched. The only thing taken was the wood stove. "You have any idea who might have done this?" the other officer asked, pulling out a notepad. "Anyone with a grudge or who might know you were out of town." That is when it hit me. "Patricia Henderson," I said. "She is the president of our HOA. She has been trying to force me to remove that wood stove for 2 months. The board overruled her, but she has been harassing me ever since." The officers exchanged glances. "Tell us more about this," the first officer said. I explained the entire situation, from the initial violation notice to the board meeting to Patricia's ongoing harassment. I showed them the emails on my phone, the violation notices, all of it. The officers took extensive notes and photographs of everything. "We are going to need to speak with Mrs. Henderson," one officer said. "Do you know her address?" "She lives 3 streets over," I said. 624 Oakmont Circle." The officers told me to stay at my house while they went to question Patricia. I called Frank, my neighbor, to see if he had noticed anything unusual while I was gone. "Actually, yeah," Frank said when he came over. "I saw Patricia's Lexus parked in your driveway on Saturday morning. I thought maybe she was doing some kind of HOA inspection or something. She was here with 2 guys I did not recognize. They had a truck, one of those U-Haul moving trucks. I figured you had arranged something with them." "Did you see what time this was?" I asked. "Around 9 in the morning." "They were here for probably an hour, maybe a little more. They loaded something big into the truck, but I could not see what it was from my house." This was exactly what the police needed to hear. Frank agreed to give a statement, and within an hour, the officers returned from Patricia's house. "Mr. Kingsley, we need you to come with us," one of them said. "We found your wood stove." I followed the patrol car in my truck to Patricia's address. When we arrived, I could see the U-Haul truck parked in her driveway, and through her open garage door, I could see my wood stove sitting on the concrete floor. Patricia was standing in her driveway, her arms crossed, her face red and defiant. Another patrol car had arrived, and a senior officer was speaking with her. As I approached, I could hear Patricia's voice, shrill and defensive. I was enforcing HOA regulations. He was not supposed to have that stove. I had every right to remove it. "Madam, you do not have the right to enter someone's home without permission and remove their property," the senior officer said calmly but firmly. "That is burglary. Burglary." Patricia's voice went even higher. "I am the HOA president. I have the authority to enforce community standards." "Not by breaking into someone's house, you do not," the officer said. "Mr. Kingsley, is that your wood stove?" I walked into the garage and examined it. It was definitely mine. I could see the serial number on the back that matched my purchase receipt. "Yes, that is mine." The officer turned back to Patricia. "Mrs. Henderson, I am placing you under arrest for burglary. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the officer continued reading Patricia her rights, she started to cry. Not sad tears, but angry, frustrated tears. "This is insane. I was trying to protect our community. He violated our rules." "The board ruled in his favor," I said, unable to keep quiet any longer. "You had no authority to do this, Patricia. You broke into my house and stole my property because you could not accept that you lost." The officers handcuffed Patricia and placed her in the back of the patrol car. Her husband, Richard, came out of the house looking completely bewildered. He claimed he had no idea what Patricia had done, and based on his genuine shock, I believed him. The police arranged to have my wood stove transported back to my house. They also needed me to come to the station to give a formal statement and provide all the documentation of Patricia's harassment. At the police station, I spent over 2 hours going through everything with a detective named Sarah Martinez. She was thorough and professional, taking copies of all my emails, text messages, and HOA documents. She also interviewed Frank, who confirmed seeing Patricia and the 2 men at my house on Saturday. "This is a pretty clear-cut case," Detective Martinez said. "She entered your home without permission, removed property valued at approximately $2,000, and did so with premeditation and assistance. North Carolina law defines burglary as breaking and entering with intent to commit a felony or larceny. This qualifies. What happens now?" I asked. "Mrs. Henderson will be formally charged. She will have a bail hearing, probably within the next 48 hours. Given that she is a homeowner with community ties and no prior criminal record, she will likely be released on bond, but she will have to face trial." I left the police station feeling drained. The whole situation felt surreal. I never imagined that an HOA dispute would result in criminal charges and an arrest. The next morning, the story had spread throughout the neighborhood like wildfire. My phone was ringing constantly with neighbors calling to express their shock, support, or morbid curiosity. Some people were sympathetic, having dealt with Patricia's overbearing management style themselves. Others seemed to think I was overreacting by pressing charges. I had to explain to several people that I had not pressed charges. The police had arrested Patricia based on the evidence. Once they found my stolen property in her garage, the legal system took over. It was not about me being vindictive. It was about the fact that she had committed a crime. The local news picked up the story a few days later. HOA president arrested for stealing members' wood stove was the headline on the Asheville Citizen-Times website. The story went mildly viral on social media, with people sharing it as an example of HOA overreach gone wrong. I started getting calls from reporters, which I mostly declined. My lawyer advised me to keep a low profile until the legal proceedings were complete. Patricia was released on a $10,000 bond the day after her arrest. The conditions of her release included staying away from my property and having no contact with me. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her as president. Sandra Hayes took over as interim president, and one of the first things she did was send out a community-wide email apologizing for Patricia's actions and assuring everyone that the board would be reviewing and updating the community guidelines to prevent future disputes. The criminal case moved slowly through the system. Patricia hired a lawyer who tried to argue that she had believed she was acting within her authority as HOA president. However, the evidence was overwhelming. The security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera had captured Patricia and two men carrying my wood stove out of my house. The two men turned out to be day laborers she had hired from a service, and they testified that she had told them she had permission to remove the stove. In February, about 3 months after the incident, Patricia's lawyer approached the district attorney with a plea deal. Rather than go to trial and risk a felony conviction with possible jail time, Patricia agreed to plead guilty to a reduced charge of misdemeanor larceny and criminal trespass. The sentencing hearing was held in early March at the Buncombe County Courthouse. I was required to attend as the victim, and I gave a victim impact statement describing how the incident had affected me. I talked about the violation of my privacy, the stress of dealing with the break-in, and the damage to my sense of security in my own home. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s named Judge Caroline Foster, listened to all the testimony and reviewed the case file before delivering her sentence. "Mrs. Henderson," Judge Foster began, looking directly at Patricia, who stood with her lawyer at the defendant's table. "What you did was not HOA enforcement. It was a crime. You violated Mr. Kingsley's home, his privacy, and his property rights because you could not accept that you did not get your way. As an HOA president, you had a responsibility to lead your community with integrity and respect for the law. Instead, you abused your position and took matters into your own hands in a way that was illegal and deeply wrong." Patricia stared at the floor, her face pale. "I am sentencing you to 2 years of supervised probation," Judge Foster continued. "During this time, you will perform 200 hours of community service. You will pay full restitution to Mr. Kingsley for all damages and expenses related to this incident, including the cost of reinstalling his wood stove, repairing his flooring, and reimbursing him for the security system he installed after the break-in. Additionally, you are prohibited from serving in any leadership capacity in any homeowners association for the duration of your probation." The judge banged her gavel, and the sentencing was complete. Patricia's lawyer helped her out of the courtroom, and I did not see her again that day. The aftermath of the case brought some unexpected positive changes to our community. With Sandra as the new president, the HOA board became much more reasonable and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. They updated the covenants to clarify ambiguous language and established a more transparent process for architectural reviews. I became somewhat of a local legend in the neighborhood, the guy who stood up to the tyrannical HOA president and won. People would stop me at the mailbox to share their own Patricia horror stories. One neighbor told me she had been fined repeatedly for having the wrong shade of white paint on her shutters. Another said Patricia had tried to force him to remove a vegetable garden from his backyard because it was visible from the street. My wood stove was professionally reinstalled, and the county inspector came back out to make sure everything was still up to code after being moved. The insurance claim I filed covered most of the damage to my floors and the cost of the new security system I installed. Patricia's restitution payments came in monthly installments, slowly reimbursing me for all my expenses. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Patricia and her husband Richard ended up selling their house and moving to a different community in South Asheville. Apparently, the embarrassment and social fallout from the case made it impossible for them to stay in Whispering Pines. I felt a twinge of sympathy for Richard, who seemed like a decent guy who had been blindsided by his wife's actions, but I could not muster much sympathy for Patricia herself. The probation officer assigned to Patricia's case was strict, and I heard she struggled with completing her community service hours. She was assigned to work at a local homeless shelter, which I am sure was humbling for someone who had spent years judging and controlling others. The restriction on serving in HOA leadership meant she could not resume the position of power that had led to all this trouble in the first place. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. I continued to enjoy my wood stove, which kept my house warm and cozy through the remaining winter months. I became more involved in the HOA board meetings, not as a board member but as an engaged resident who wanted to make sure we maintained a healthy, reasonable community environment. The case attracted some attention from legal circles as well. A local law professor wrote an article about it for a property law journal, discussing the limits of HOA authority and the potential criminal liability for overreaching enforcement actions. My lawyer David mentioned that the case had been cited in a few other HOA disputes as a cautionary tale. One evening in late spring, I was sitting on my back deck, enjoying the mountain view and a cold beer when Frank came over with his dog. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Not at all," I said, pulling out another chair. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "You know," Frank said eventually, "I have lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. I have seen 4 different HOA presidents come and go. Patricia was by far the worst. What she did to you was crazy, but in a weird way, it might have been the best thing that could have happened to this community." "How so?" I asked. "Because it showed everyone what happens when you give small-minded people unchecked power," he said. "The new board is so much better. They actually care about making this a nice place to live, not just enforcing rules for the sake of enforcing rules. And people are more willing to speak up now when they think something is unfair. You standing up to her gave everyone else permission to do the same." I had not thought about it that way, but Frank had a point. The community did feel different now. There was less tension, less fear of petty violations, and more of a sense that we were all neighbors rather than subjects under HOA rule. "I just wanted to keep my wood stove," I said with a laugh. "And you did," Frank said, raising his beer bottle in a toast. "Here is to wood stoves and standing your ground." We clinked bottles and sat watching the stars come out over the mountains. The legal resolution of the case took about 6 months from the initial incident to the final sentencing, and the probation period would last 2 years. During that time, I occasionally thought about Patricia and wondered if she had learned anything from the experience. Did she understand that being in a position of authority did not give her the right to violate other people's rights? Did she regret her actions? Or did she still believe she had been justified in trying to enforce what she saw as community standards? I would never know the answers to those questions, and ultimately, it did not matter. What mattered was that justice had been served, both legally and within the community. The criminal justice system had held her accountable for breaking the law, and the HOA board had held her accountable for abusing her position. My life continued, enriched by the warmth of my wood stove and the hard-won peace of knowing I had stood up for myself. The whole experience taught me some valuable lessons about property rights, community living, and the importance of reasonable leadership. It also taught me that sometimes you have to draw a line and defend what is yours, even when it means facing conflict with someone who has more formal authority than you do. The wood stove itself became a symbol of that fight. Every time I loaded wood into it, every time I felt its radiant heat warming my living room, I was reminded that I had refused to back down. I had done my research, followed the rules, and when someone tried to bully me into compliance with their personal interpretation of those rules, I had fought back through proper channels. And when those proper channels had failed to stop Patricia's harassment, when she had escalated to the point of committing a crime, the legal system had stepped in and held her accountable. That was how it was supposed to work. Not through vigilante action or theft, but through laws and consequences applied fairly and equally. As the months passed and Patricia's probation continued, the Whispering Pines community settled into a new normal. The board under Sandra's leadership focused on actual improvements, things like fixing the broken street lights at the entrance, organizing community events that brought neighbors together, and maintaining the common areas. They enforced rules when necessary, but with common sense and proportion. I never saw Patricia again after that day in court. I heard she had gotten a job at a retail store in South Asheville and was keeping a low profile. Her husband Richard had apparently been deeply embarrassed by the whole situation and had insisted on the move. Some neighbors who ran into them at the grocery store said Patricia looked defeated, older somehow, as if the weight of what she had done had finally sunk in. Part of me hoped she had learned her lesson. Another part of me suspected that people like Patricia rarely change fundamentally. They might modify their behavior to avoid future consequences, but the underlying belief in their own rightness, their own authority, probably remained. That was not my problem anymore, though. She was out of my life and out of the community, and that was enough. The story of what happened became something of a legend not just in Whispering Pines, but in HOA communities throughout the region. I heard from a friend who lived in a neighborhood near Charlotte that their HOA president had referenced my case during a board meeting, using it as an example of what not to do. Several online forums devoted to HOA issues featured threads discussing the incident, debating the limits of HOA authority and the importance of following legal procedures. I even got a call from a documentary filmmaker who was working on a project about HOA abuses in America. I politely declined to participate. I had no interest in becoming the poster child for HOA resistance. I just wanted to live my life, heat my home affordably, and be left alone. The security system I installed after the break-in gave me peace of mind. I set up cameras covering all the entrances to my house, with cloud storage for the footage. If anyone ever tried something like Patricia's stunt again, I would have clear video evidence. Not that I expected it to happen. The new board was reasonable, and most of my neighbors were good people who just wanted to maintain a nice community. By the time summer rolled around and I did not need the wood stove anymore, I found myself looking forward to fall when I could fire it up again. It had become more than just a heating appliance. It was a reminder of a battle fought and won, of standing up for myself against unreasonable authority, and of the importance of knowing your rights and defending them. The final payment of restitution from Patricia arrived in August, almost exactly 1 year after I had installed the wood stove that had caused all the trouble. With that payment, the financial aspect of the case was closed. She still had another year of probation to complete, but that was between her and the court system. My part in the story was essentially over. I used some of the restitution money to buy a nice stack of seasoned oak for the coming winter. The wood delivery guy, a grizzled local named Chuck who ran a one-man operation out of his property in the mountains, had heard about my situation. "You are the wood stove guy," he said with a grin as he stacked the split logs in my backyard. "That HOA lady went crazy trying to take your stove." "That is wild, man." "Yeah, it was definitely an experience," I said. "Good for you for fighting it," Chuck said. "These HOAs think they can control everything. Sometimes people need to push back." My brother lives in a neighborhood with an HOA, and they tried to tell him he could not park his work truck in his own driveway. His work truck? How is a man supposed to make a living? We talked for a while about HOA overreach, and he shared several stories he had heard from other customers. It seemed like almost everyone had an HOA horror story, though few escalated to the level of criminal charges and arrest. After Chuck left, I stood in my backyard looking at the neatly stacked wood, enough to last me through the winter. The mountains rose in the distance, green and lush in the summer heat. The air smelled of pine and the faint wood smoke from someone else's fireplace or burn pile. This was why I had moved to Asheville in the first place, for this connection to nature, this slower pace of life, this sense of being somewhere real and grounded. Patricia had tried to take that from me, not just the wood stove but the peace and security of my home. She had crossed a line that should never be crossed, and she had paid the price. The justice system had worked the way it was supposed to work, slowly but effectively, holding her accountable for her actions. As I walked back into my house, I passed the wood stove, silent and cold in the summer heat, but ready to provide warmth when the cold weather returned. I ran my hand over the smooth cast iron, cool to the touch now but capable of radiating serious heat when fired up properly. "We made it," I said quietly to the stove, feeling a little silly but not caring. "We won. And we had, not just the legal battle or the fight with the HOA, but something bigger. We had won the right to live peacefully, to make reasonable decisions about our own property, and to be protected by law when someone tried to violate those rights." The 2 years of probation that Patricia received might seem light to some people, but it was appropriate for the crime and the circumstances. She had no prior record, and while what she did was serious, it was not violent. The probation, the community service, the restitution, and the public humiliation of the case were all consequences that would hopefully deter both her and others from similar actions in the future. More importantly, the case established a precedent. HOA officers who overstepped their authority and broke the law would face real consequences. That message rippled through our community and others, making at least some people think twice before engaging in heavy-handed enforcement tactics. As fall approached and the leaves began to turn brilliant shades of orange and red across the mountains, I prepared for my second winter with the wood stove. I had the chimney professionally cleaned and inspected. I checked all the seals and gaskets. I organized my wood supply and made sure I had plenty of kindling and fire starter. The first cold snap came in late September, and I lit the first fire of the season. The wood caught quickly, and soon the familiar warmth was spreading through my living room. I sat in my chair, watching the flames dance behind the glass door of the stove, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction and contentment. This was mine. I had fought for it, defended it, and kept it. No one could take it from me again. And more than that, I had helped make my community a better place by standing up to a bully and holding her accountable. The wood stove crackled and popped as the fire established itself, the sound as comforting as the warmth. Outside, the temperature was dropping as the sun set behind the mountains, but inside my home, I was warm and safe and at peace. Patricia Henderson was somewhere else, serving out her probation, hopefully learning that positions of power come with responsibilities and limits. The community of Whispering Pines was thriving under better leadership, with clearer rules and more reasonable enforcement. And I was exactly where I wanted to be, in my home, with my wood stove, living the life I had chosen. The whole experience, from the initial installation to the final restitution payment, had taken about a year. A year of stress, conflict, legal proceedings, and uncertainty. But in the end, it had been worth it. Not just because I got to keep my wood stove, but because I had learned something important about myself and about the importance of standing up for what is right. I had discovered that I was capable of fighting back against unfair authority, that I could navigate complex legal and bureaucratic systems when necessary, and that doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, led to outcomes worth having. Those lessons extended far beyond the specifics of wood stoves and HOA disputes. They were lessons about citizenship, rights, responsibilities, and the kind of person I wanted to be. As the fire burned down to coals and I prepared to load more wood, I reflected on how different my life might have been if I had simply given in to Patricia's initial demand. If I had removed the wood stove when she first ordered me to, I would have lost $2,000. I would have faced high heating bills again, and I would have taught myself that bullies win when you do not stand up to them. Instead, I had stood my ground, and while the fight had been harder than I ever expected, involving police reports and court appearances and media attention, the outcome had validated my decision. Patricia had been held accountable. My rights had been protected. The community had benefited from better leadership. And I had my wood stove, keeping me warm and comfortable while saving me money on heating costs. The flames danced in the stove, casting flickering shadows on the walls of my living room. Outside, the night was cold and dark, but inside, everything was warm and bright. I was home, I was safe, and I had won a victory that mattered. That was enough. That was everything.